Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love. My co-host Wilfred Riley is on his way, but we have a guest here who's going to be really interesting, but has a short window, so I don't want to hold her up. And as you can see again, comedian Lou Perez is with us. Hello again, Lou.
Hi there.
And I guess this week is Batya Ungar-Sargon. She is the opinion editor at Newsweek, a returning guest, author of Bad News, and author of the new book. I usually hold them up when I have them because I'm so happy to have them, but you have 40 or so behind you. It is Bad News. I'm on your old book. Second Class. How the
Charles,
elites.
why don't you open that up and show the nice people?
I won't do that.
Lovely
She started already.
inscription.
She's starting already. Let me get the title out and then we'll give a disclaimer.
No,
Second
because I
Class.
want to tell the story of that inscription
I
at
will.
the book party.
Can I talk about it for Second Class, how the elites betrayed America's working men and women? Batya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here with you. I'm very
Well-
excited for this conversation.
Well, if this is going to be hard for me, I always talk about how it's hard to interview my friends. Batya is very difficult. If you go back to the last time she was on, she took 40 minutes interviewing Shamika and myself and not allowing us to talk. But she wanted me to show it. So I got an autographed copy of the book. I don't know why she's making a big deal, Lou. Haven't you ever seen books being autographed before? So this is an autographed copy. I don't know why she wants me to show it. So it's long. So what? So
It
you
looks like you
words.
wrote your own forward.
Now, what do you want to say about that?
No, just that when I was writing that inscription, there was a character who was in the book who was at the party. And I, of course, sent him his own copy, inscribed it, etc. But when he saw how long the inscription I wrote for Charles was, he was a little offended. He was like, I'm in the book and my inscription is not that long. And Charles proceeded to make things very uncomfortable for me by showing everybody how long the inscription was.
In my
That-
defense, you wrote it at the book signing event. So it's not like you did it when no one could see it. I didn't just bring it and show up and say, look at, is yours this good? You
It's
decided to write
called
that
called
thing.
inscription envy. And a lot of men suffer from it.
Right. So needless to say, I've met Batya once or twice. And so I'm going to try to stick with the book and not challenge her. She claims that I'm mean to her and I'm difficult, but I won't be there. You've seen this podcast before. I'm never difficult with anyone. Why would I be difficult with Batya? So I read your last book, had you on to talk about Bad News. And I want to start by asking, was it the findings, the reason you write about this, the class warfare and the situation dealing with working class people, did that come out of the last book or was that something you were planning before? How did you get to the class divide?
Yeah, it definitely came out of the last book, because in the last book, I was writing about how the problem with our media today is not that it's left, although it is, it's that it's woke. And wokeness is how basically our elites created this social justice language around race and gender. They started talking about these issues in a very extremist way. And I argued to mask the ways in which they had benefited from income inequality. Basically, the people who call themselves left in this country today are quite wealthy, and they are also the people who became journalists, and their culture is very alien from the way most Americans talk and think and work and live. And I kept kind of reaching for a book where I could say to people like, look, you're part of this elite, so it feels innate to you and it feels true to you that, let's say America is a white supremacy. But like that is so alien to how Black people and Hispanic people and Asian people who are working class, who are not part of this elite, talk about their experience of this country. And I kept I wanted there to be a book I could say to people, read this, you'll understand how working class people think and talk, because it seemed to me like our elites were incredibly devoted to a kind of paternalistic way of seeing the world. They really love authority and big government and, ceding power to the powers that be. And working class people really value autonomy and self-determination and freedom and sticking it to the man and, being in charge of their own lives. And I kept reaching for a book to be like, here, read this, you'll understand what I'm saying, like why nothing you say makes sense to normal people. And there just wasn't a book like that. So I was like, okay, maybe there's room to write a book like that. And everybody told me not to write this book. But eventually I was just like, look, the class divide is the defining feature in American life today. And there's no book that's really like for this moment saying this is how working class people see what has happened to them in this country. Basically, they become second class citizens. And so that's why I wrote it.
Well, Lou, before we get into the book and talk about that in more detail, she said something that's really important that I think is overlooked. The book is good that it covers that. And then you hear, when you talk about the class, a lot of people talk about a class divide. And a lot of people who talk about middle class talk about the fact that middle class is going away. It's a smaller middle class. It doesn't function the same way. So they talk about other aspects of class, which is true. And Batya, I'm going to come back to you to make my point by talking about your interview on Bill Maher's show. And that all ties together. So Lou, what I want to say about that is there's another important class issue that is rarely talked about. And I want to get your opinion and then Batya's, because I don't think she talked about this much in the book, a little bit. But we had Tucker on, and he was talking about, we were talking about one of his books. And, he made this really interesting point about how while there is a gap financially between the poor and the wealthy, and that gap may be bigger, that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is that they don't really walk through the world together anymore. Like you used to be, if you were wealthy 50 years ago, you still didn't have a private jet. So you might be in first class, but you still sat in the airport with the rest of the people when you flew, right? You didn't have a driver. You didn't have, these estates on an island around gated community where no one saw you, right? So even where people had money, they weren't so isolated. So now it's not just the fact that you have more money than me, it's that you literally have no idea how I live, what my norms are, what I think about. We've had some political in the past, some little snippets of it, like where what was it? Bush went to the store and didn't know what the checker was, or another politician didn't know what the price of milk, or those kind of things. I'd never gone shopping, those type of things. But I think that's the bigger issue. I want to know what you think about that, Lou, from a class perspective.
Well, I think it's also an issue too, where I think a lot of people who, I remember reading something about people who are polled don't necessarily know which class they fall into.
Yeah.
Like, so you have people who are, who are relatively very wealthy who think that they're middle class, and it also depends on where they live too. Like, $100,000 salary doesn't get you as far in New York City as it would in, say, like, upstate New York. But it's interesting, the idea that the classes are more isolated, because I feel like there is so much that that is available to all classes, where it's like you have relatively poor people wearing designer clothing, and then, stuff that was, unreachable, years ago, like something like technology, like the cell phone, like back in the 80s, it would be like a Wall Street guy who's, with this gigantic brick. And now it's, everybody has a cell phone. I get, I had a flip phone once, and a homeless guy made fun of me for having a flip phone when everyone else has a smartphone. It's like, that's sort of the level we are. So it's interesting, the idea of this divide. And, I wonder, I mean, how deep does it go? I mean, maybe I'm just like in a bubble myself, where the people who I'm associated with, I mean, I do comedy. So, I get to, when I do live shows, I got, working class people there. I got, the older people who, might have a little bit more wealth and all that. So I don't know, maybe I'm a little more blind to it. And I'd be interested to hear, where you guys are on that.
Well, Basia, to that, maybe you can shed some light on that for him by talking a bit about, and I thought about your interview. I almost wanted to turn it off if it wasn't you. I was so mad. When I look at the subtitle, when you talk about the elites betraying America, I got problems with elites like you do. I'm not defending them, but I try to be fair and say, are they really betraying them? And I kind of start to think, most of the time I think yes, but then I listen to people like Bill Maher and I think, no, Bill Maher, whatever you like or dislike about him, really believes what he's saying. He really thinks that he doesn't realize he's disconnected from regular people, right? Because he's been in his bubble for so long. He's, you can tell a little bit about, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but a little bit about how that interview went, how you were, it was beautiful, how you kept asking him a question, how he was talking about something, you just tried to get him, and you got him to repeat something that he said, which proves that he doesn't understand people. He tried to say basically that people were better off than they thought they were. They just weren't smart enough to, you remember that?
Yeah.
But I think he it's not like he doesn't care. He's not an elite that's trying to take away their opportunities, but at the same time, he simply doesn't get how they live, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people on the left are like that. They are disastrously wrong about policy, but they wouldn't be able to be so wrong for so long if they weren't literally lining their pockets with the proceeds of these bad policies. So, things are much worse objectively for the working class. There are working class jobs where you can still make it. You could still have the American dream. If you're a cop, if you're a firefighter, if you are a skilled trades person, if you work in steel and aluminum. Thank you, Donald Trump, for 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum from China, which protected that entire industry. Like there are jobs where you could still, you're making $80,000, $100,000 a year as a working class person. But it used to be that the largest chunk of the GDP was in the middle class. It was the biggest sector of our population was middle class. Today, the largest sector of the GDP, over 50% of the GDP, is controlled not by billionaires, which is the fiction that the left likes to spin, but by the top 20%. So people with multiple degrees who work in professional managerial jobs control over 50% of the GDP. So the middle class has shrunk, but it's been squeezed both up and down. So if you get that college degree, you get squeezed up, and now you're making a starting salary of $100,000 a year, and the sky's the limit. You're going to marry somebody else with that degree. We're no longer a country where a doctor marries his nurse and a lawyer marries his paralegal, but the lawyer now marries another lawyer. They now have a combined income when they're 45 of, $1 million a year, and their cleaning lady is now competing in the same housing market as them. So it used to be that maybe that doctor would have married his cleaning lady, and they would have been competing with their one income of, nice income, but whatever, upper middle class with another upper middle class person. Now, basically that top 20% is an elite caste that controls so much of the GDP. And it's so funny because they love to rail against the billionaires, but the share of the economy that's controlled by the billionaires has not significantly changed between 1971, which was the high watermark for working class wages, and today. It's pretty much the same for the billionaires. It's just that top 20%. And you're right. You could be very poor and still have an iPhone. But if you are working class, the most modest version of the American dream, owning a home, having adequate health care, your kids having as many opportunities as you do, and being able to retire in dignity, these things are now increasingly out of reach for the majority of people who don't have a college degree. And that's unacceptable because we all rely on them to survive. And they're not asking for the world. They're just asking for what was guaranteed to every factory worker, basically, in 1971. And now people who work 2-3 jobs, they work really hard and they can't afford that stuff.
Here's another great point. I'm sorry, Luke, real quick. Another
Okay.
great point about what you just said, though, is that say what you will about the billionaires, the difference is when you compare what you just said, comparing the billionaire to the white collar workers making $100,000 a year, right? And the journalist from your bad news book. The billionaire, at least, He might be hosing his employees, maybe or maybe not, but he has employees and he's
Yeah.
creating a project people want. Those other people aren't inventing or creating
Yeah, they're
anything.
rent
No
seekers.
jobs, no product, no products, nothing. They're like politicians. They're making money, but they're not producing anything. So
Right.
then there's that. But what were you going to say, Luke?
No, I remember some years back, I said, wow, look around. It's very interesting that all these millionaires want me to hate billionaires.
Right.
It's almost like I don't want to do, it's like, that's a
No, it's so funny
happened.
because they said like it's like a thing they made fun of Bernie Sanders about. Like for his whole career, he was railing against the millionaires and the billionaires, the millionaires and the billionaires. And then, he wrote a best-selling book and suddenly it became the billionaires, they're fleecing you, the billionaires. Like, well, because Bernie became
The
a
top
billionaire.
0.10004%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And your Bernie's actually really good.
Thank you.
That kind of blew me away.
Open borders. That's a Koch brothers proposal. It's Bernie in
Right.
2015.
Right. And look at him now. He would never say the things he said about that, about guns, none of the stuff. He's a whole different man, or he's just quiet. So how did you meet the people that you wrote about?
Oh, it's such a good question. I wanted them to be representative of larger trends. I knew that I was only going to be able to feature a certain number of people in the book, but I didn't want them to be random, and I didn't want it to be just like who was in my immediate circle, my like friends and family networks. I wanted them to have kind of representative heft. So I started with the data. There's a professor at Brigham Young University called Joe Price. And he has a sort of team of grad students, and journalists can ask them for help. Stupid people like me who have degrees and, multiple degrees in English literature can like ask them for help, like understanding numbers and data. And I asked them to take a look at the American Census Survey and to compare 2000 to 2020 and to give me like a bird's eye view of who is the American working class. How old are people? What races are they? Where do they live? What jobs are they in? What is the home ownership rate? What is the home ownership rate by occupation? What is the home ownership rate by occupation, by state? So I kind of knew like what I was looking for. Like I wanted to see those trends developing and understand like from just a data numbers point of view, who is the American working class and do they still have a fair shot at the American dream? And then once I had that data set, I kind of knew what I was looking for because I could see those trends. So for example, something that surprised me was that 50% of people who work as maids are homeowners. So I knew that I needed at least one person who was in cleaning who was a homeowner and at least one person who wasn't, not in the book, but to interview for myself so that I knew that I was kind of understanding those trends. I ended up speaking to a lot of people who clean toilets for a living and get a lot of dignity out of it. Which makes me extremely angry when elites say like, well, no one wants to clean toilets. Why shouldn't we just open the border and bring in desperate people from Venezuela to do it? No American wants to do that. It's such utter, what I should say to them is cut the bull.
or when your mayor says we need to bring them in and have them be lifeguards. I mean, they can swim.
I know.
They're Mexican. Why not have them be your lifeguard?
Exactly.
For those who are not in New York,
like, he's like almost like saying, like, how do you think they got here?
That's basically what he meant. I mean,
that's actually a racist
wetbacks.
joke about the Mexican Olympic team that he was on the verge of making. Like, if you listen to the New York mayor talk, he's come close to it like 3 times. But hi, by the way.
I really like him, but I felt like he really wanted to say wetbacks.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Look at what we call them. I mean, obviously they could be a lifeguard.
Anyone that can run, jump, or swim already is in there. I mean, that's the line. So
right. So since you're already queued up, Will, we're talking obviously about the book and about class, and you talk a lot about class, the importance of that and how we can fix some of our problems by looking at that rather than race. So what are your thoughts on, as the subtitle says, the elites betraying the American working class?
yeah, I mean, so a couple things. First of all, obviously, I disapprove of racism. Let me note that we're all successful, and I'm against racism. I'm 10 toes down against racism. But I mean, I like the book. Obviously, I agree with much of it. The one thing that I would say is this seems to be an analysis specifically of the working class. And Batya is absolutely correct that the working class has become more penalized, forced into more competition with rising tides of immigration and so on. That's absolutely correct. I think the one response, I'm more on her side, but the one response that a lot of political scientists would give is that's actually because a lot of people have moved into the middle and upper middle class to some extent. Like, so the society itself isn't necessarily more unfair than it was. I mean, certainly if you look at where women are and so on down the line. Like, and I think that to some extent I would agree with that in a lot of cases. Like when people say, well, in the 1950s, you had all these one earner homes, dad worked and mom stayed home, and like you could afford a home on one salary and everyone was happy. I mean, like realistically, if you look at any data about like relationship and sexual satisfaction for like men and women in that era, or like domestic violence in both directions, or military service injuries for males, and just like on and on through all that stuff. Like even what the salaries were, getting away from the personal stuff, which is something I read about. But like, I mean, just the house you would buy would be, one of you guys might correct me, but the average is like 890 square feet, something like that. Like my impression pretty consistently is that you could do that now. Like if you and your young wife, if you're a master carpenter and you really are dating someone who's a homemaker and who wants to open up a cake shop, and you set up a small business at home and you both work 12 hours a day, but one of you stays home, I'm pretty sure you could afford an 890-foot square home in like an ethnically integrated working class suburb with a lot of immigrants in it. You wouldn't have, central air conditioning. You'd have one television. You'd have one car. Like that life that people lived in the 50s is still possible. I think that's something that has to be considered. And Baya does consider this in the book, but is that nobody wants to do that. So there are two trends. There are three trends really. One is that like we are kicking the working class's ass. Like we're bringing in mass immigration is going on. There's constant shitting on the working class too, from everyone from rappers to CEOs. But the second is that we're also seeing a lot of people progress out of the working class and develop almost unrealistic expectations in life. So, I mean, that's the second thing, where a lot of people that are talking about how they can't afford to have kids, for example, these are my friends that are like 36-year-old lawyers who went to the University of Illinois or to Brown. So I think there are almost two different patterns going on. Like the reality is that most people and everyone I just described could afford to live like Homer Simpson or like a family in the 1970s. They just don't want to. And those two trends are almost parallel to each other. The people in the two groups don't intersect.
Batya?
That's my comment.
So you're right that Democrats took a lot of people who used to make wages on a par with what working class people did, right? Like college professors, right? Who would earn the same as like high working class people in the 60s and 70s, and catapulted them into the top 20% with a series of disastrous and, yes, Charles, betraying the working class policies, including opening the border, having mass immigration, NAFTA, getting rid of vocational training, all sorts of things that widen the divide between the upper middle class and the working class. And yeah, you're right. Mass immigration makes rich people much richer, right? Like you're totally right about that. But I don't know that that's something we should be celebrating because it came at someone's expense. Like it was a plunder of the middle class by these elites through very intentional policy. We have an absolute housing crunch. We're short about 7 million homes, 7 million units. And Joe Biden just welcomed in 8 million illegal immigrants who all have to live somewhere, right? You totally agree with me about that. But the problem is that, yeah, I mean, you can be pretty poor and be a homeowner in West Virginia. It's true. But the idea that people should be untethered from community, from the places where they were raised, from their families, like that too leads to the kind of atomization that leads to kind of the spiritual malaise, the downward mobility, the deep, deep loneliness that people are going through. And so it may be true that there are many places that you could be. First of all, a skilled carpenter, by the way, is going to have no shortage of finding. You could probably buy a house in New Jersey very easily, But I think the idea that like the kind of libertarian answer to this is, well, why don't people just move? There are plenty of places where, first of all, in the places where homes are more affordable, there's often not as many jobs. As soon as a hub opens up, housing prices go up. I mean, Billings, Montana right now, housing has become totally unaffordable. Montana,
Arkansas.
like all the places that like, young urbans go to get out of these housing crunches. But so I think that there's an objective problem in terms of housing, and it's the reason that the houses are so big is actually because these couples where you have, two professional couples earning these, professional salaries, they're NIMBYists. And so what they do is they pass these zoning laws. 78% of land zoned for housing in America is zoned for single family detached, meaning you can only build one unit on this parcel. And so you have to basically build a McMansion because it's in a place where, the land itself is so valuable at this point. And so they're like artificially limiting the amount of housing units that we can build. And of course, the left's answers to all of this are terrible, right? Because this is a supply and demand problem. And the left's answers are all about increasing the demand, right? They want to give people vouchers, like they want to give
Right.
Section 8 out. Which basically would just make more people be able to afford these homes, which would make even more demand, and then constantly limiting the supply. So anyway, yeah, I think we agree on more than we disagree about. It's great that there are more people in the upper middle class. The problem is the process whereby that happened, which is by putting a premium on the kind of garbage education that we see these kids protesting at Harvard. I call them the know nothing they thems, like that is the pathway to the American dream. Like that is unacceptable that the people who are changing the diapers of our grandparents so that they can live out the end of their lives in dignity are going to struggle for the rest of their lives. And the know nothing they thems who are literally being praised by the Ayatollah, like Ayatollah Khamenei's like, kids, you're on the right side of history. They're going to have the American dream. Like, I think probably we would all agree that there's something really messed up about that.
Yeah,
Right.
I don't, as a very brief response there, I don't think we're passionately disagreeing about that. And yeah, the Ayatollah telling the feminists to read the Quran is one of the funniest things I've seen recently. I mean, he
So
did
good.
like literally like the commander of the other side, the jowly Muslim ex-fighting man with the kufi on said, if there's one book these people should be reading, it's the Holy Quran. And I mean, all these professors were chipping in like, best you'll get out of these bastards is the Cliff Notes. I mean, it was pretty entertaining. Chat GPT. But I mean, like, though, the one comment that you just made there that's really interesting is that we are prioritizing the wrong skills to some extent. I think that's a key point. And I think that anyone who's worked in a blue collar field, as I did in college, not with any great nobility, but I mean, anyone who's ever been a carpenter, canvasser, construction worker, something like that, mailman, understands this to some extent. And friends in the crew have had all of those jobs, blacktopping, that sort of thing. So that's true. And there are other things like working as a professional butcher that are just useful for society.
Yeah.
So sure, I mean that's far more important than being a adjunct professor of gender studies or something. But I do think that there are two different trends, and that all of my working class friends have kids.
Right,
Like
right,
all of my boys
exactly.
from back home in East Aurora, Little
Right.
Italy, Bronzeville, Cloverland, they all have like 4 kids. And they're struggling with how to deal with them. But it
Right.
is like mom is like a nurse of some sort, like an LPN, dad is a high iron man, and you make it work. Like you live in some uncle's house or something.
Yeah.
Most of the
What
people,
your lawyer friends mean when they say we can't afford kids is we don't have $100,000 a year for their
correct.
tuition at this private school that we would never consent to send them to public school, although we also oppose charter schools because
Right.
God
Yes.
forbid, poor Black kids have that choice.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So the point is just reading through the book and reading through a lot of other literature and academia. Actually, you almost have the two different directions. Like we're not prioritizing the traditional human skills, welding or something like that, talent baking, talents that we've had for 500 years. So there are a lot of people that are getting screwed. But in fact,
But
a lot of
also, wait,
Americans.
I just want to make a point I think you're going to like, which is like,
Okay.
it's not just that we're
Right.
not prioritizing that, it's that there has been like a concomitant war on masculinity culturally by these same elites in order to justify their betrayal of working class jobs that involve brawn and physicality. Like, in order to justify that betrayal of the working class man, exactly, they created this. And I don't know if this was like conscious or not, but, coincidentally, there developed a feminist literature and narrative that was mainstream through the media that said that masculinity itself is a crime, that all the mating rituals that we relied on as a species to survive for millennia, for as long as human history has existed, are crimes, and that wanting to be a provider, wanting to be macho, wanting to be physically fit and work with your body and bring something to the table that only a man can, all of that is a crime against humanity. And that was the perfect narrative to justify this betrayal of all of these working class people. And so the culture itself, you see how it kind of is a perfect complement to this economic policy that they created that put money back into the like pockets of like this feminized, like leftist elite.
Lou, what were you going to say?
Yeah, for one, I think Batya sounds just like that dude who plays for the Chiefs there for a second, which is but something a couple of years ago I did a show, and the two comedians that came up before me, one was from Sweden and one was from Switzerland. It was just like kind of a random, lineup. And when I got up there, I said, normally, I'm a libertarian, so I'm for open borders, but these fuckers are coming for my job. So now I want to, Donald Trump build the wall. And I said it in jest, but in reality, like I am a libertarian, and I think libertarians tend to have they're kind of acerbic when it's like you said, move, learn a new skill, without without dealing with the real, human, I think, reality there. And the truth of the matter is I'm not competing with a lot of foreign born stand-up comics or, producers and that sort of thing. So I don't know what it's like being on the ground, save somebody in the trades or somebody with a, unskilled labor, doing that. So I think having, some empathy for the people is really, really important. And then also, with that, I think what's important to me too, because I've sort of, and this is like, I guess a little personal, just in like the stuff that I'm doing. There were a number of gigs that I had that were to, be producing stuff that fell through. And I'm sort of like, oh shit, like that's income that I thought I would have, and now I don't have it. What skills do I have that, I could, go out and, take care of my family? So I think it's really important to, to have some empathy for people and understand that, people are going through different things in life. And then also being able to come up with some sound advice for people who are going through it, like even like Will, like the example you gave, you have the family, working class family, they have the kids, they're staying at uncle's house, or they're, starting small, and then they're going to, save up and build out from there. So I think that's important. So it's not all just kind of like doom and gloom. It's also, there's light out there at the end of the tunnel. How do we get there?
Well, that's a good segue. What I want to say, because I know Batya doesn't have much time, so I want to get to, what she learned from them. And the common thing in the book that she talks about, I like how they were not as, tethered to politics like we see in the media and that thing. They had more important things to focus on. But there was the part of the book that's most interesting is their views. Some of them may be Batya, some of them she's just speaking for, relating what they say. But, like what the government should be doing and what business should be doing, what they're doing well and what they should be doing more of, and that kind of thing. And it was kind of like a push and pull between the two. So I want to get everyone's kind of views on some of those things. And obviously we talked about immigration, but what businesses should be doing, the benefits cliff, as she calls it, housing and all those things. And I just want to say, I know we talked, it came up briefly when we had, I think, which one was first, Will? We had Noah Smith on and Michael Schellenberger. Didn't know they had beef. That was pretty funny. And we were talking about
I forgot that. They had kind of an economics battle or something. Yeah.
Right. And
Going back and forth in the journals.
Right. And we were talking about that and it came up then. But I think that I'm the only one here of the four of us that is, has been middle class, in two different industries, one with a degree, one without a degree, a business owner and homeless. So that being the case, I was reading these stories and I was kind of like,
I've been strictly ghetto and upper class, which actually shapes my personality. Like kind of just a contempt for conventional ethics. I like it. Just a good balance.
So I'm reading this, Batya, and I'm wringing my hands because I think what made me think about it, I said it was Noah's interview, and I said he was talking about homelessness in California and what they do, whatever. I said, if I was homeless, I could fix that in 8 months, right? Right. So I'm like, obviously there's a balance between the government is screwing things up and hurting people, and they need to fix that. There are some shyster business leaders out there, and that's bad. But there's also a personal responsibility component. So what do you think with that, Batya? And
Can I
talking to them and
really
learning from
briefly
them, what
say
do
one
you
thing though? Most of
what?
my boys fix it at like 6, but that's a long fucking time to be homeless, Charles.
What'd you say?
I mean, that's like, I mean, you're about right. Like, most of my buddies fix it at like 6, but that's a long fucking time to be homeless, man. Like sleeping in a car. I mean, so that's like, I mean, that a lot of poor people have had some experience with that. That's a long time to be like living in a Winnebago. I'm putting that out there.
Now I do set aside like medical conditions because that throws a lot of things off. But barring that, I mean,
No, but
there
you're
are
right.
things.
Like, you live in a van with your girl or in like a church basement or something for like a couple months. That's it. But that's a very unpleasant experience. And I think, again, that contrast, that's one of those experiences you have as a poor or even working class person that most people don't have.
Right.
Like, you're just
And
sleeping
some of the
outside
people
for
in the book
six
did that,
months.
but you know, so what do you say, Batya, of like how do you do the balance both from you can mention what they said, but how do you do the balance between what the government should be doing more of and what the government should be regulating business do or what businesses are already doing on their own?
None of these people wanted handouts. They
Right.
believed very deeply in the value of hard work. They were really proud of being hard workers, and they all worked incredibly, incredibly hard. They really believed in personal responsibility, and they really believed that it was your responsibility to overcome whatever kind of, like they would say, like the game may be unfair, but you have to play it. Like you can't just sit it out and live off the government. They had a lot of sort of contempt for that and for people they knew who did that. Um, they favored within the United States very much free market solutions,
Mhm.
but they wanted trade policy that favored American workers, border policy that favored American workers, and then, collective bargaining or something. They didn't find unions very appealing because, okay, so this was my best attempt to understand why. I think, first of all, it's because the national unions embraced open borders in the 90s along with the Democratic Party, and they felt like they were kind of embracing the competition. But
Mhm.
also, as people who work very hard, there is this kind of very entrepreneurial spirit in the American worker. And I think to them, a union may protect you from like bottom floor wages, but they also saw it as limiting your ability to rise due to your
Yep.
own efforts. Like they saw it as kind of like, well, there's a bracket for how much somebody in this job makes.
Yep.
But what if you're amazing at your job? You can never then convince your boss to give you that raise. Like they felt that there was something like not meritocratic about
I used
unions.
to say this all the time. It regulates sameness, not fairness.
Right. So people who are sort of lazy, which are not the people I interviewed, maybe like that because you can sort of, not work, not put in so much effort and still get, all of your benefits. But these people, I know some of them were in unions and like Amy, who's in the book, who's
Yep.
a certified nurse's aide, before her union came to the nursing home she works in, she was making $10 an hour and the union got them up to $18 an hour. That's something she could never have accomplished on her own. But then ironically, a year later, the agencies that compete with the nursing homes that send out people to different nursing homes every day and don't give benefits, they now start them at $24 an hour. So you can go to the sort of crappy agency, which won't give you benefits and won't give you a stable place where you get to know the patients and you develop a relationship with them and with management, but they're making more hourly. So she felt kind of undercut by that. Like they worked so hard as the union, they had this huge victory. And then it was sort of, so I think the answer is like, they feel personal responsibility is very important, but they also feel like it's sort of a crapshoot if you make it or not. And they didn't understand why some people made it and some people didn't. There was no law. It was kind of like a 50-50 shot. You could make all the right choices. You could work and work and work. You could say no to every vice. You could be so responsible and still like it's a 50-50 shot. Forget about if you make a mistake. Like they felt that there was no way back on. And, Charles, like you're a very exceptional human and like you are and it's not I'm not like some people are not exceptional and our economy really needs a lot of people who are not exceptional, who are just good enough at their jobs. Maybe the thing that's exceptional about them is that they can do rote work that's very boring and show up on time and do it every day, right?
Right. Right.
And those are not the type of people who they're going to be able to like get homeless and still find their way back and face this problem and that. And that is what we actually need of them. Like the economy is actually built on the labor of people doing very rote work. And we should be grateful to them that they're willing to do it so we can do our very interesting jobs and use our whatever.
No. I agree with that. No, that's fine. But Lou, what do you say about so like in the book, and I get it. And some of the people that she interviewed were honest. They were like, look, she would ask them these questions like, look, I'm just a regular guy. I don't know policy enough to know that, but I have my thoughts, but I don't really know. But what I find is with most things, a lot of the politicians and the activists don't have good intentions, but even the people with good intentions, they don't think all of these ideas through. So she writes about a lot of ideas, the fight for 15, the degree things, unions, banning the box, all these things, healthcare stuff. And some of them had like, Gore's from Canada. So he's like, don't get too excited about it. So yeah, something small is better to have universal health care. It's cheaper. I can get stuff fixed. But if something bad happens, you're going to wait and live until you die. So, right, there's a trade-off to that. And then in America right now, where we're so partisan, no one trusts the government. So yes, it's cheaper, but do we want the government doing it? Do we want them deciding when you get to go to the doctor and when you don't, and when it's covered or when it's not? I think there's too much power there. And then the last one I want you to think of, Lou, is the banning the box that Walmart does versus the degree thing. One of the funniest things for me was that when I was switching careers, I got into a job. It was a company that only hired people as temps. And I got the job only because I had a degree. But the job, I used to jokingly say, what's the job like? I was like, a trained monkey could do it. I said, I take that back. That's disrespectful to the monkey. But this is one of those super liberal CEOs, very famous. It was a woman, so everybody loves it. She was probably the most famous female CEO at the time. And couldn't stand her. But anyway, everybody's like, she's so great at all this stuff. But she had this policy that everyone from the guy mopping the floor to the guy in the boardroom all had to have a degree. And that was hurting people because it was limiting opportunity. So some of them spoke to that. But then at the same time, they're saying you should put a box on the application or take it off the application. So you shouldn't have to tell people whether you're a felon. I think you should hire felons based on the type of work they're doing, but I still think you should have the right to know. It's like starting off a relationship where they can just lie about stuff. So a lot of these answers aren't really, I guess I'm saying, they aren't really as simple as they seem. And a lot of people with good intentions just say, well, why don't we do this? Because it feels good.
Oh no, I totally agree. And I think it's also important for people to own up to their fuck ups. In particular, people who put forward fucked up policies that have a negative,
they're the last people that have to own up to it.
Exactly, the negative trade-offs. And I think that's one of the that's one of the big problems. And Batya and Will could probably talk about this too, about so much of what happens in government isn't from elected leaders. It's from, bureaucrats
unelected
bureaucrats, who have these, this incredible power to do stuff. Well, one of the examples that I give is years ago when Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York City, he really wanted to ban big gulps.
Yeah.
Remember, he wanted to ban, he's like, there's a limit. He wanted to put a limit on how much soda a person could buy, right? And here's a guy who is a billionaire. He has a media empire, right? This guy with all that power couldn't convince people, hey, don't drink that much soda, right? Instead, he tried to go the government route. I can't convince you of changing your evil ways. I got to force you to do it. So I think that the tendency there is for, rather than, persuasion, it's always, if I could put some force behind it, I can get you to do it.
Right.
And he failed, thankfully.
Yes. But yeah, how are you, the book, how do you think the book will serve to the people you're talking about them, but do you think the elites will read it? Will somebody whisper in their ears? Will they know about what, I mean, because the biggest problem, and we talk about this a lot, is that there are plenty of regular Americans out there that get the problems, that work hard, that don't think all the white supremacy is bringing their lives down, all this other stuff, don't care about whether you're gay or not. They just don't care, right? They don't want to celebrate it. They just don't care, right? But they don't get a voice. All we hear is the danger from the media. So, I mean, I know you've done, your work to change it as much as you can, but what do you think is in the future? I mean, I mean, now you can't vote for your guy. Your guy's going to prison now. So, I mean, I know you were the Trump socialist. So now that we found out today that Trump's going to do life,
First of all, I'm undecided. I'm not making any endorsements. I still have not decided who I'm voting for, although I will
what?
say
Oh,
that
you mean
there
between
is,
Biden and RFK? Oh,
I
because Trump's
will,
gone. Trump's gone, right? So,
well, I hope he's not, because I've heard from people on his campaign that the book has been circulating there. So
oh, okay.
Getting
Yeah, so what do
traction,
you think
hopefully.
comes from this? How do you think, not just your book, but how do you think we turn the tide on the class gap and
I think
the
it's happening.
mm,
I feel like it's happening. I could be just an optimist. I'm often wrong about everything, but
true,
I
true,
feel like there's like it's
everything.
so funny. I was recently talking to I was invited to give a talk before a group of like very high profile economists for a big hedge fund. I don't know why they let me through the doors.
Hmm.
And I was kind of like, it's one thing to rail against you guys on cable news. It's another thing to do it to your faces. But
Hmm.
they were, at one point, one of them said to me, like, how good could Donald Trump really have been for the working class? I mean, aside, okay, fine, I'll give you trade and I'll give you immigration. But aside from that, what did he really accomplish in terms of the economy of the working class? And I was kind of like, it's kind of like, but apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? Like, what, I mean, you're the economist. You tell me what else makes up an economy aside from like trade and immigration, like
Jobs, right?
manufacturing.
Labor and capital. Other than that, like
It was just so funny how people but Trump did he did such an amazing job on trade. There's no going back to the kind of NAFTA, free trade with China. Like Biden kept all of his trade policies when it came to China, and he's amping them up now because he sees how popular they are with the working class. So like on that, he really did set a new bar that now the Democrats have recognized. So like at least on trade, there's been just real lasting change.
So you
The
do see a
Democrats
momentum
need
moving
to,
in the right direction.
yeah, and I think that after this disaster, I mean, if Biden loses significantly, which I think he might, hopefully their message is not going to be, oh, he was too old, and they will understand that a lot of that has to do with immigration and how that's basically a proxy for jobs and for the economy and wages for working class people. So I do think that it's kind of, and now when you're seeing, I mean, if black men turn up for Trump, that's going to be a real kick in the pants to the Democrats. Like they're going to have to either right the boat or realize that like their voter is the Nikki Haley voter, right? Like it's going to be like they have to figure this out, right? So I feel pretty, I mean, it's so funny because like Trump really is not running as a Republican. He's running the third party campaign. RFK is running as a Democrat and Trump is running as a third party candidate. There's no real Republican in this race if you're thinking of the GOP like from 2010, 2012,
Right.
2014. So in that sense, I think like he really murdered the GOP that was just the party of the rich. And
Mhm.
now the Democrats have become the party of the credentialed elites and the poor, the dependent poor. But that there's just not enough there, I don't think, to make them competitive. And after a few cycles, it's like they have to figure this out. So I feel pretty good about it. I think, but I could be totally wrong. I'm often very wrong for just pure optimistic reasons.
no,
She
that's
is
about
very
right. I mean,
often
one obvious prediction in
right.
political science is the Democrat just openly running as a communist. I mean, us realigning in the way the
Right.
Europeans do. I mean, the
Right.
Republicans are the center right populists that are often still like guns, but that favor some social programs, and the independents are the Democrats, and then the Democrats are the Ilhan Omars and AOCs with the Kafayas on and so on. And I mean, I think that's pretty likely looking at the demographics of the Democratic Party, where like the urban black vote or the Islamic vote in the USA is going. I wouldn't be surprised if we have a more European realignment. I actually don't think demography is destiny, but it's sometimes pretty predictive.
Mhm.
Well, I guess
And
we'll
I mean,
have to
that
leave it.
obviously is one reason why the Democrats back mass illegal, non-vetted migration. Like, that's not a crazy racist theory. There are whole books about that, like Teixeira's The Emerging Democratic Majority and so on, where like people that I've met at conferences who are funny guys will really openly say, like, our time is coming. And that fell out of fashion over the past 10 years. But I mean, we'll see whether or not that pans out in the end.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. She is Batya Ungar-Sargon, the author of Second Class, Bad News, Newsweek opinion editor. Batya, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a real pleasure.
Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.